The Mirror and the Horizon. Have you ever noticed how easy it is to spot a smudge on someone else's glasses? We see the tiny speck of dust on their lens with perfect clarity, pointing it out with confidence. Yet we often walk around completely oblivious to the fact that our own vision is blurred by a thick layer of fog. It's a bit like trying to clean a window from the outside when the dirt is actually on the inside. We scrub and we polish. We point and we shout, wondering why the view remains so dull, never realizing that the only hand that can reach the grime is our own, from within. There's a question that has stayed with me for years. What if the thing that annoys us most about other people is the very thing we refuse to see in ourselves? What if every frustration we feel towards others is actually an invitation to look inward? Today, I want to explore this with you, not as someone who has mastered it, far from it, but as someone who is still learning, still stumbling, still discovering how much easier it is to hand out advice than to take it. And perhaps by the end, we'll both see something a little more clearly. Let me tell you about a man named Arthur. Arthur was a retired head teacher living in a leafy suburb of Surrey. He was, by all accounts, a good man. The kind who paid his bills on time, kept his garden immaculate, and wrote thank you cards for things most people would forget. He had a daughter named Sarah. She was his only child, and for many years they had what most would call a warm relationship. Sunday roasts were a tradition. Sarah would come over with her husband, and Arthur would carve the chicken with the precision of a man who had spent decades marking papers with a red pen. They talked about work, about the garden, about the neighbours. It was, on the surface, everything a father could want. But Arthur had a habit. It was a habit born from love, or at least what he thought was love. He couldn't help but notice things. He noticed that Sarah's husband didn't seem ambitious enough. He noticed that Sarah's career choices were, in his words, not making the most of her potential. He noticed that their house could be better organized, their finances better planned, their lives better everything. And so, Arthur did what he thought a good father should do. He offered suggestions. He clipped articles from newspapers about healthy eating and posted them to Sarah with little notes. Thought this might be useful. He sent books about productivity, about marriage, about how to be more successful. He meant well. He genuinely believed he was helping. But something began to shift. The Sunday roasts became shorter. Sarah started arriving later, leaving earlier. The conversations became more careful, more guarded. Arthur noticed this too, of course, and his instinct was to address it, to sit Sarah down and explain, once again, how she could improve their relationship. He didn't see the wall that was slowly being built between them. He only saw that she wasn't listening. Arthur's helping extended beyond his family. He was, in his own mind, a pillar of the community. He had opinions on everything and everyone. He left polite yet pointed notes for his neighbour about the exact height the hedge should be maintained at. He sent clippings to his sister about the dangers of biscuits, convinced she was eating herself into an early grave. He was a man of high standards, and he felt it was his moral duty to ensure everyone else met them. His intentions were, on the surface, noble. He wanted a better community. He wanted a healthier family. He wanted a more disciplined world. But the strange thing was, the more Arthur tried to fix everyone, the more everyone seemed to avoid him. His sister stopped answering his calls. His neighbour built a taller fence. And most painfully, Sarah began making excuses not to come over. Work is mad at the moment, Dad. We've got plans with friends. Maybe next month. One afternoon, after a particularly tense phone call with Sarah, where she told him quite bluntly that she couldn't breathe under the weight of his constant improvements, Arthur felt a heavy, cold vacuum in his chest. He sat in his perfectly silent living room, surrounded by his perfectly dusted books, his perfectly arranged furniture, and felt utterly, miserably alone. The silence pressed against his ears. He looked around at his pristine home and realized something uncomfortable. Everything was in order, except him. He thought to himself, "Why is everyone so stubborn? Why can't they see I'm only trying to help? If they would just listen, life would be better for all of us." But a quieter voice, one he had ignored for years, whispered back, "Or perhaps the problem isn't them." He decided he needed a break from the stress of his ungrateful family. He took a train into London, wandering aimlessly through the streets. He wasn't a particularly religious man, but he liked history. He liked the weight of old places, the sense that people had walked there before him, carrying their own burdens. He found himself in Westminster Abbey. The dim, hallowed silence wrapped around him like a heavy blanket. He wandered through the soaring arches, past the tombs of kings and poets, until he found himself in the crypt below. It was there, in the cool, quiet air, that he remembered a story he had heard years ago. A story about an inscription, one that supposedly could be found on the tomb of an Anglican bishop. Whether this inscription truly exists or not, I cannot say with certainty. But the words themselves, the message they carry, have stayed with countless people for generations. Arthur stood still, and the story came back to him with startling clarity. The bishop wrote, "When he was young and free, his imagination knew no bounds. He dreamed of changing the entire world, but as he grew older and wiser, he realized the world wouldn't budge. So he narrowed his sights and decided to change only his country. Yet the country seemed just as immovable, rooted in its old ways. In his twilight years, in one last desperate attempt, he tried to change his family, those closest to him. But they too would have none of it. And then the inscription reaches its heartbreaking climax. The bishop, lying on his deathbed, finally understood. If I had only changed myself first, then by example I might have changed my family. From their inspiration and encouragement, I would then have been able to better my country. And who knows, I may have even changed the world." Arthur stood in that crypt, the words echoing in his mind, and felt something crack open inside him. If I had only changed myself first. It felt like a physical blow. He thought of the articles he sent his sister, while he himself struggled with a secret, bitter temper that he refused to acknowledge. He thought of the notes he left his neighbor about the hedge, while he himself hadn't spoken a kind word to that neighbor in 3 years. He thought of all the advice he gave Sarah, while never once asking himself what kind of father he was being. He realized that he had been trying to paint the entire world green, while his own brush was completely dry. He had been so busy being a sender of messages that he had forgotten how to be a practitioner of the truth. This is a trap we all fall into. We read a beautiful piece of wisdom, something that speaks of forgiveness or patience, and our very first thought isn't, "How can I do this?" Instead, it's, "Oh, I wish my husband could hear this," or "I must send this to my colleague. They really need to work on their attitude." We treat wisdom like a hot potato. We want to pass it on to someone else as quickly as possible before it has a chance to burn our own hands and change our own hearts. But the truth is, the world is not a single giant entity that we can grab and reshape. The world is simply the sum of us. It is a massive tapestry made of billions of individual threads. If you want the tapestry to be a more beautiful color, you cannot shout at the other threads to change. You can only ensure that your thread is the brightest, strongest, and most vibrant it can be. There is an old teaching that suggests the true mark of a person seeking a better life isn't found in their ability to lecture others, but in the quiet, persistent effort they make to transform their own character. We can recognize a person of true goodness not by their outward labels or the advice they give, but by the way they struggle against their own shadows. It's about the person who, when faced with an impulse to be selfish, chooses to be generous. The person who, when feeling the sting of an insult, chooses to respond with silence or a smile rather than a clever retort. The real work, the only work that actually changes the atmosphere of a room, is the work we do on ourselves when no one is watching. But let me share another story, one that brings this principle to life in a different way. There was a young lawyer in South Africa in the late 1800s. He had been educated in London, wore a proper suit, carried a briefcase, and had all the markings of success. He was, by his own later admission, a rather argumentative young man, quick to take offense, eager to prove himself right, and deeply concerned with how others perceived him. One day, he was traveling by train. He had purchased a first-class ticket, as he had every right to do. But when a white passenger objected to sharing the compartment with him, the young lawyer was forcibly removed from the train and left on the platform in the cold night. He sat there, humiliated and furious. He could have responded with rage. He could have demanded justice, shouted at the injustice of it all, written angry letters to newspapers about the unfairness of the world. And to be fair, the world was unfair. The system was wrong. But something happened in that cold night on that platform. Instead of focusing entirely on what others should change, he began to ask a different question. What can I do? What kind of person do I want to be in the face of this injustice? That young lawyer was Mohandas Gandhi, and that night on the platform was the beginning of a transformation that would eventually lead him to become Mahatma, great soul, and help lead a nation to independence. But here's what's remarkable. Gandhi didn't start by trying to change the British Empire. He didn't start by demanding that others behave differently. He started with himself. He began experimenting with his own life, simplifying his possessions, examining his own anger, practicing non-violence not just in his actions, but in his thoughts. He once said, "Be the change you wish to see in the world." It's a phrase that has become so famous, it almost feels like a cliché. But when you understand the context, when you see that it came from a man who spent years working on his own character before he ever tried to change a nation, it takes on a different weight. Gandhi understood something profound. You cannot force the world to be peaceful. You can only be peaceful, and let that peace ripple outward. Arthur went home that evening, but he didn't send any articles. He didn't write any notes. He didn't pick up the phone to call Sarah and explain what she was doing wrong. Instead, he sat in his living room, the same living room that had felt so empty just days before, and he asked himself a question he had avoided for years. What is it like to be on the receiving end of Arthur? The answer was uncomfortable. He realized that being around him must have felt like standing under a constant, gentle rain of criticism. Not harsh enough to storm about, but persistent enough to soak right through. The next morning, he saw his neighbor struggling with a heavy bin. Usually, Arthur would have watched from the window and made a mental note about the neighbor's poor lifting technique. Instead, he went outside. He didn't offer advice. He didn't mention the hedge. He just grabbed the other handle and helped him move it. "Thanks, Arthur," the neighbor said, looking genuinely surprised. "I appreciate that." Not at all, Arthur replied, and for the first time in years, he didn't follow it up with a suggestion on how to better organize the recycling. He just smiled and went back inside. A week later, he called his daughter. He didn't prepare a list of topics to discuss. He didn't think about what advice she might need. He simply said, "Sarah, I've been thinking. I've been quite a difficult man to talk to lately. I've been so busy trying to fix your life that I forgot to just be your father. I'm sorry. I'd love to see you, whenever you're ready. No lectures, I promise." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and then a soft, shaky breath. "I'd like that, Dad. I'd really like that." Arthur realized that the oasis of comprehension he had always dreamed of wasn't something he had to travel to find. It was something he started to build the moment he stopped pointing fingers and started opening his arms. The winds of peace don't start as a hurricane that sweeps across the globe. They start as a gentle breeze created by a single person choosing to be a little more patient, a little more grateful, and a little more humble. So what can we do today? Not tomorrow, not when the world gets better, but right now. Perhaps it's as simple as the bishop's story suggested. Perhaps it's about looking in the mirror before we look out the window. Maybe today is the day we stop sending the helpful articles and start living the wisdom ourselves. Maybe it's a good morning to the person we usually ignore. Maybe it's a thank you that actually carries the weight of genuine appreciation. Maybe it's just a smile offered to a stranger who looks like they're carrying the weight of the world on their shoulders. Or maybe, and this one is harder, it's about pausing before we offer advice and asking ourselves, have I earned the right to say this? Am I living this myself? When we change, the world around us has no choice but to respond to that change. It is the law of the universe. Light doesn't ask the darkness to leave. It simply shines, and the darkness vanishes. Let us be the light. Let us start with the only person we truly have the power to change. Let us start with ourselves. Now, whether that inscription truly exists on a bishop's tomb in Westminster Abbey, I honestly cannot say. Perhaps it does. Perhaps it doesn't. But what I do know is this. The truth of those words doesn't depend on the location of a stone or the name of a bishop. The truth lives in the reflection they inspire within us. It lives in the moment we pause and ask ourselves, what if I started with me? What if I stopped waiting for the world to change and became the change myself? That is what truly matters. Not the verification of a historical detail, but the awakening of a human heart. And if this story, whether rooted in a specific tomb or born from the collective wisdom of countless souls who have walked this path before us, can help you see yourself a little more clearly, then perhaps it has already done its work. I hope this story found its way to your heart today, perhaps at just the right moment. If you felt a connection to Arthur's journey, or if that reflection sparked a little light in you, please do let me know in the comments. I love hearing your reflections. It reminds me that we are all walking this path together, one step at a time. If you found comfort in these words, perhaps you'd like to save this video to revisit when things feel a bit overwhelming, or share it with someone who might need a gentle reminder to breathe and look inward. And of course, if you'd like to join our little community here at Moments of Peace, we'd be so honored to have you with us. Until next time, take gentle care of yourself. Remember, the world becomes a more beautiful place the very moment you decide to bring your own light to it. Peace be with you.